It gives me great pleasure and welcome you this evening, on this glorious evening, to Dalgan. And in particular, I welcome Archbishop Aidan, Roisin, Colin, Father Sean, and John, and the members of the Larkin family and friends who are joining us this evening. I'd also like to welcome Cecilia, Caroline, Elizabeth, who are representing Messenger Publications. You are very welcome. This evening we celebrate the fruit of Father Aidan's labour as we see his dream come true with the publication and the launch of his book, The Spiritual Journey of St. Patrick. Building on the work of Father Dan Keneally and Father Paddy Baskerville, Aidan has created a refreshing and informative study on the spiritual journey of St. Patrick. I would like to acknowledge the tremendous work of Colin and Father Morris in bringing this work to completion. In his introduction to this work, Aidan states his purpose in writing it. And if I may quote, he says, "My purpose in writing this book is not to resolve every problem Patrick's writings pose. Instead, my aim is pastoral. I wish to evangelize. I wish to put myself at the service of God and of Patrick, who in heaven prays continuously for his people here on the earth." This evening, as this wonderful piece of writing is launched, we can have confidence that Father Aidan's prayers continue for each of us as we draw strength and inspiration from his writings. Thank you for joining us. You are all welcome.
We are privileged to have the successor of St. Patrick to launch Father Aidan Larkin's book, The Spiritual Journey of St. Patrick. I also welcome Aidan's family and friends, especially Colin, who together with the staff of Messenger Publications prepared a final editing of the work. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the book, I think a brief history is in order. This book is meant to popularize the new approach of Columban Father Daniel Keneally, that he worked on St. Patrick's correspondence for many years. Dan Keneally's research on St. Patrick's letters began when he was editor of the centenary issue of the Far East in 1961. And from then until his death in 1986, he spent his leisure time working on it. But already from the middle of the 20th century, scholars were paying particular attention to Patrick's correspondence, searching for dates and places, biographical as well as historical material, to discover something about 5th century Ireland, while dismissing the poor quality of Patrick's Latin. This scholarly focus led them to neglect the rich spiritual and theological content of Patrick's correspondence. In fact, Patrick used colloquial Latin rather than classical Latin, and he used that Latin from his church surroundings and looked for models in biblical and patristic writings to articulate his message. Dan Keneally realized that such scholarly work was incomplete until Patrick's letters were studied in their textual connection with sacred scripture and with the writings of the fathers. Only then would we be enabled to discern the full theological, ecclesial, and spiritual meaning of the texts. Dan's research covered 73 notebooks and added a new dimension to patrician studies. After his death in 1986, Columban Father Paddy Bastable and Dr. Teresa Iglesias from UCD helped arrange the material into manuscript form. Unfortunately, Paddy died in 1992 and did not live to see the fruit of his dedicated effort. But thanks to Teresa and to staff members at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, the completed work entitled The Letters of St. Patrick by Daniel Conneely was published by Unsoggarth in 1993 and served as a resource for Father Aidan's work. Father Kieran Waldron recalls Dan telling him of his special interest in this unresearched dimension of Patrick's writings. Dan believed that a background in theological studies was essential to illuminate Patrick's writings, which never had been attempted either by theologians or patristic scholars up to that time. He believed that Patrick was not only a great missionary, but a man of great intellectual standing as well. So Dan Conneely set about compiling a scriptural, ecclesiastical, and patristic critical apparatus. This provided evidence of Patrick's familiarity not only with the Old and New Testaments, but linked him with up to 20 patristic writers. Dan's wish was to communicate his research not only to scholars, but to present to ordinary people his new translation of the two pastoral letters, together with their theological, spiritual, and missionary content. Ordinary people would then be able to see for themselves that Patrick was a churchman and a missionary of outstanding competence, a person of intellectual stature, and above all, an apostle of faith life that revealed a deep connection between his theological knowledge and holiness of life. This latter task was assigned to Aidan Larkin. Patrick's correspondence are the two earliest documents in Ireland preserved in their original form in Latin. Both are pastoral letters. The earlier of the two documents, the letter to Coroticus, a Christian British chieftain and slave owner, whose soldiers had slaughtered some of Patrick's newly baptized converts and carried others off into slavery. The letter attests to his outrage at the treatment of his newly converted Christians. But what emerges most of all from the letter is his great love for the Irish, for whom he spent his whole adult life dedicated to their welfare and to their eternal salvation. The letter then is more an expression of anguish of a shepherd whose flock had been decimated by ravenous wolves. As a bishop, he imposed the penalty of excommunication on those responsible in the hope of calling them to repentance. The other letter, the confession, is primarily a letter in praise of God, an acknowledgement of God's mercy and grace that he experienced throughout his whole life. Patrick was well acquainted with the Bible and used it to articulate his own faith life, especially the Psalms. He also quotes and alludes to church fathers and echoes their phraseology. In particular, St. Augustine, to whom he refers 20 times in all. Patrick's theology was influenced by the theology of grace of St. Augustine and St. Paul's theology of mission. And so, in a simple written account, he highlights God's goodness and mercy and the amazing grace evident in the success of his mission work among the Irish people. So, looking back on his life, he sees the pattern of God's wonderful design in the apparently haphazard events and struggles despite his own shortcomings. As a teenager, he was converted from unbelief and disobedience to the service of God. And from that starting point, he develops in detail the evidence of God's protection and guidance in all his sufferings, in all his dangers and labours that he was able to endure, as well as visions and revelations that he received. All his labours resulted in the flourishing Christian communities that he founded. So, as a confessional, autobiographical literary genre, it is primarily an account of his religious experience that began during the years of his captivity, his encounter with God during that time, and his missionary experience among the pagan Irish. All of these experiences served to deepen his spiritual life until he reached old age when he penned his confession. And so, as a spiritual testament at the end of his life, he realized that his role was providential, as well as a gift of God's grace, which he wanted to make known to all people to encourage them in the faith. Our interest in St. Patrick, then, is mainly in his faith life, which means living with Christ in our minds, in our hearts, and in our actions. And so for Patrick, the Bible became the language of his faith life. His favourite source was the Psalms, which voiced the living faith of God's people. And so we may distinguish faith life from faith belief. Faith life shows how the gospel is actually lived out in daily life as a personal encounter with God, while faith belief affirms and protects that faith life, like creeds and doctrines. Patrick himself lived towards the end of the golden age of the fathers, who gave witness to the living presence of the faith, and so contributed to the development of the Church's tradition. Over 20 fathers are referenced in Patrick's correspondence, which shows his clear dependence on them. Since the papal mission of Palladius occurred in 431, scholarly opinion today favours 493 for the death of Patrick, whose mission would have begun probably around 462. At 16, he was captured and sold into slavery in Ireland for 6 years. But he finally escaped and returned home. He then decided to respond to the call of God to return to Ireland to evangelize it. This included preparation for the priesthood, most likely in France, and consecration as a bishop to prepare him for his missionary work, which continued until his death. Father Aidan Larkin was responding to Dan Keneally's wish that his research on Patrick be made available to the general reader. Unfortunately, as his health deteriorated and he passed away in 2019, Aidan was unable to see the fruits of his dedicated work in book form. But thanks to his brother Colum, the book was recently published by Messenger Press, entitled, as you know, The Spiritual Journey of St. Patrick. And so we are grateful to the staff of Messenger Press for their interest and for their valuable assistance. We are indebted to Aidan for a very engaging and erudite presentation of Patrick's profound spiritual legacy. So this rereading of Patrick's correspondence is of special relevance at a time of rapid social change in Ireland. Our Christian faith and values, which formerly shaped our Irish identity, are today under constant challenge. For this faith life has profoundly shaped our culture and who we are as a people. Its loss would leave us at the mercy of the latest fad or the prevalent utopia. And that is why a return to Patrick's correspondence can guide us to recognize who we are as a people and help us to remain true to the faith life that was first lived out by Patrick himself.
So, good evening to you all.
Sean.
I'm delighted to be here this evening to see the fulfillment of a long cherished hope that Aidan's book would be published, and the Messenger publications have come to our aid and have presented it in a very attractive form. We used to go on holidays with him to Spain because we both speak Spanish, having spent years in Chile, and we would take a week or two, maybe hire a car and drive around Spain and go to Salamanca and Santiago de Compostela and so on. Enjoyed that. The first evening, we had a little apartment. Threw his bag up on the bed. I threw my bag up on my bed. Opened his bag and out came 4 fairly heavy tomes about early Celtic Christianity and early Irish saints and so on. I opened my bag and out came 2 John Grisham novels. So I don't have a holiday, but Aidan was clearly going to do a bit of study. That evening he asked me to help him to go up the town, and the Parkinson's was beginning to take its toll on him, so he found it difficult to walk too far. But he went up the town anyway, and he found like a bookshop, a stationery shop, and he bought some jotters, some notebooks, some pens, and brought them back to the house and spent most of the 2 weeks writing the bones of this new book. So he was very committed, very determined to get this book published. Anyway, that's just a little story about him. Holidays in Spain. He was still studying St. Patrick and St. Columbanus. I read a little article in an American magazine recently about the disciple of Ireland. And we note from the famous first sentence of the confession, he starts off in Latin, Ego patricius peccator rustissimus et minimus omnium fidelium. I am Patrick, a sinner, peccator, unlettered, the least of all the faithful. And he goes on to describe how he was a stone lying in the mud and the Lord had reached down and pulled him up out of the mud. So this little article I came across, it says that despite his popularity, we know very little about St. Patrick. And here are a few facts about him that may surprise you. Some surprises about St. Patrick. The first surprise, the first Patrick was not Irish. Even worse, he may have been British. So more surprises coming. The next surprise says that he's clearly the patron saint of Ireland, but he has some other unexpected patronages. He's the patron saint of Nigeria, due to the good work of the Irish missionaries who brought the faith to that African country in the 19th century. So that's another surprise then. He's patron not just of Ireland but of Nigeria, and he's the patron saint of migrants because of his association with the Irish, who were also migrants. The last surprise, he did not drive the snakes from Ireland, since there were no snakes on the Amber Nile to start with. That's 3 surprises. And this is the 4th surprise now. Is Aidan's book, where Patrick says that he's rustissimus. I'm a country bumpkin. I'm a rustic. I have no learning. I never went to college. Surprise, surprise. He's familiar with the scriptures and familiar with the church fathers. Many 20 quotes, or is that what you mentioned there, Father Morris? 20 quotes from St. Augustine, and maybe Jerome in there, and other famous church fathers. So that's a surprise after that opening paragraph, where he says he's totally ignorant and he's a sinner. Surprise, surprise, he's very learned. He's a very cultured man. So that's 4 surprises. That's enough to keep you going, isn't it? I'll just finish up on a little note. As a family, we're delighted that his work has come to a happy conclusion. And I'll take this opportunity then to say a word of thanks to the Columbans, that Aidan was happy to be a Columban priest. And as a family, we appreciate the support and the care he was given here in Dalgan Park, especially in his later years when he was getting the Parkinson's was taking its toll. They were very good to him, nursed him very well, took good care of him, especially in those last difficult few years. So, muchas gracias.
Father Mossy promised me that I didn't have to speak, but just to be here. But there are just a few words I would like to say. That I'm overjoyed to be here, and to be here in Dalgan. I think there's something very fitting about us launching this book here, not just because of Father Aidan, of course, and Father Dan, Father Bastable, and others, but I think if you feel that the whole missionary genes around this place, I think are deeply significant to what Father Aidan was trying to do in his book, and I'll explain that in a moment. The second thing is the timing of this launch. I mean, we're just after Ascension and Pentecost, where we're preparing to celebrate the Feast of the Holy Trinity, and yet the date we selected was quite by accident, but it's so fitting. And to explain that, I just want to say that for me, this book allows me to get a much broader vision of St. Patrick than perhaps I had grown up with. And even in my own studies, and even reading a lot of the other literature about St. Patrick, in some ways it kind of narrowed my vision of St. Patrick. You know, to think of him, you know, to go into the detail of, you know, where was Banadin Temernier and all of those other controversies surrounding his life. But in some way they narrowed my focus. But Father Aidan's book has broadened my vision and focus of St. Patrick to see him in a new context. And for me, the big contribution of this book is the way that he relates St. Patrick to the whole missionary endeavour of the church, beginning, of course, with the Great Commission to go out to the whole world. And Father Aidan points out aspects of the life and writings of St. Patrick that I had perhaps missed or neglected in my many readings of the Confession and the letter to the Coroticus. So, for example, he doesn't see himself as just a little part of a mission to Ireland. He sees himself part of the whole entire mission of the Church. And indeed, St. Patrick also connects himself, therefore, to the Scriptures, to his contemporaries. And we sometimes forget that the Church Fathers, well, they weren't exact contemporaries, but they were near contemporaries of St. Patrick. I mean, St. Patrick is writing within a century of the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople. He's a contemporary with the Council of Chalcedon. So immediately, even to use that language is to lift Patrick out of a narrow gaze and present him, or at least connect him, to the universal mission of the Church. It's beautiful to hear Patrick almost feel that the world is about to come to an end. Why? Because he's now bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. Because quite literally, he believed Ireland was the last outpost of the mission. So as he was going out as a pioneer to bring the gospel to Ireland, after that the world could end. Because he'd have fulfilled those words that Luke wrote in Acts of the Apostles when Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and to the ends of the earth." And after that, it's over. So in some ways, St. Patrick, yes, he sees himself as a sinner. He's extremely humble. He thanks God for the way God, as Mossy said, lifted him up and put him at the very top of the wall. But I feel he does have a consciousness that what he's doing is essential work to finish off the work of evangelization. So the connection that Father Aidan, Father Dan's work does for me is to reaffirm a new commitment to St. Patrick as a saint for the whole world, a saint for the whole Church, not just for Ireland or the Irish. And we have maybe in a way captured him and caricatured him a little bit too much down through the centuries. So, but not only is he a saint for the whole Church, but I think Father Aidan's work reminds me that St. Patrick is a saint for our time. You know, he's not just for back then. And I think most recently, of course, as we've become hugely conscious of the evil of human trafficking, there's just one way in which we see how Patrick empathizes with a whole host of people nowadays who are forcibly moved from their country, or indeed who are forced from their circumstances to have to leave home as refugees, migrants, etc. And also, Aidan, because remember, the book is entitled The Spiritual Journey of St. Patrick. It almost invites us to reflect on St. Patrick as an inspiration for our own journey of faith. So, to conclude, for me, this book's major contribution is to seeing St. Patrick as a saint for the whole Church or the whole world, and as a saint for our time. And for that, I'm extremely grateful to Father Aidan and to Colum, to Mossy, of course, and to Messenger Publications, everyone who has at last brought Father Aidan's work to the huge audience that are just waiting to gobble it up. Just before I came here tonight, I went in for my tea. I went down to the graveyard, the cemetery here, and I really just felt that connection. You know, I was able to find Father Dan's grave in 1986 there and just say a prayer. And just I felt, you know, I hope Father Dan feels that there's something special has now happened. And I certainly believe Aidan would feel that. So thank you all so much. It gives me great joy to formally launch The Spiritual Journey of St. Patrick, published by Messenger. So thank you all for being here. Thank you.